Year of the Bible podcast, brought to you by Belle Aire Baptist Church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Welcome to Belle Aire Baptist Church's Year of the Bible podcast. I'm Steve Hiller, along with Pastor Grant Gaines. And Grant, we wrapped up in our last podcast the book of Matthew. Today, we're getting into the book of Mark.
Yeah.
And before we dive into any specific section, kind of give us an overview of the book, if you would.
Yeah, so Mark is more than likely the John Mark that you read about in the book of Acts. That's probably who's writing this book, which is really interesting because John Mark and Paul kind of had a falling out.
Right.
If you remember that? He was one of Paul's missionary companions on his trips, and Paul wound up not wanting to take him on the next one. And then, evidently, somewhere along the way, Mark becomes a companion of the Apostle Peter. And in 1 Peter 5, verse 13, Peter says, she who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. That's the same Mark who's writing this gospel. The Gospel of Mark, it's John Mark from earlier in the book of Acts, and he calls him his son. So this is son in a spiritual sense, not biologically. Evidently, Peter had developed a close mentoring relationship with John Mark, or Mark, the author of this gospel. And early church tradition also kind of points to this and talks about Mark kind of serving as Peter's interpreter and writing down the things that Peter said. So most scholars think of the Gospel of Mark as basically Peter's teaching about Jesus, all the things that Peter saw as he was accompanying Jesus in his ministry, all the things Peter learned from Jesus filtered through Mark, his companion, who's writing all this stuff down. So more than likely, a lot of what you see in the Gospel of Mark is eyewitness testimony from the Apostle Peter himself, written by his companion Mark. And so Mark is also probably the earliest gospel as far as when it was written. And so this one came before all the other ones. It's the shortest one too.
Yeah.
One of the features that maybe as you've been reading through the Gospel of Mark this week that you've noticed is there's a little word that always is repeated over and over and over again. It's the word immediately. Maybe you notice that he's fond of that word. You know, immediately this happened, and then immediately Jesus said this, and when Jesus casted out the demon, immediately the demon fled, and so Peter is he's moving quickly. That word immediately, he's moving quickly through the event. Someone once described it as the Gospel of Mark is almost like a highlight reel of all that Jesus was saying and doing, just one scene after the next, moving real quickly to keep people's attention and to fit as much into as little space as possible. It also, though, has a theological significance. As soon as Jesus would do things, immediately things would happen. And Mark uses the word that way. So again, Jesus, tells the wind and the waves to be silent, and immediately they hush and they're still, or cast out a demon and immediately it flees. And so it's another feature that you probably notice as you're reading this.
Yeah, and I love the fact that it does move that quickly. I've know that there's different schools of thought, but I've often thought that for a new believer who really needs to get to know Jesus, Mark is one of the best gospels to have them read first because of that. It does.
Well, and I mean, he doesn't even give you the childhood of Christ at all, the birth of Christ. He just starts with the ministry.
Yeah.
He just wants to start right where most of the action is, and so that's just the way his book is. It's a good place to start for that reason, I think.
Yeah. Since you brought up, kind of potential church ideas or history. I'm wondering if you heard anything about this. I've also heard it said that people think that maybe the young man in the garden who, when Jesus was being arrested, who left his clothes behind so he could escape, was John Mark.
I've heard that too, and I'm not sure if that's exactly right or not, but it very well could be. And that's another thing about these Gospels and about the epistles too, is there are so many names mentioned. In some of these gospel stories, you've got people's names mentioned and other people identified in the epistles. In the opening and the closing of a lot of the epistles, they're naming people's names. There's places, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul's talking about Jesus being raised from the dead and how 400 people were eyewitnesses.
Yeah,
he appeared to over hundreds of people. I think one of the significant things about this, as we read through the New Testament, that we don't need to miss, is just how many eyewitnesses there were to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. These Gospels read like history. they don't read like fantasy. When you pick up a fantasy book and you read it, it's way different than the way the Gospels read. These are meant to be historical accounts where real people are named. The initial audiences that were reading these books could say, oh yeah, John Mark, I know where he lives.
Yeah.
I can go ask him about this. Or, this eyewitness that's mentioned over here that Paul talks about, I can go talk to that. They're still alive, and we can get eyewitness testimony that way. It just speaks to the credibility, I think, of the Gospels and of the New Testament.
When we were talking about Matthew, you had said that really the big part of the purpose of Matthew was to show the Jewish people that Jesus was the Messiah. Did Mark, you think, have a kind of, this is my intent? Mark and Peter, this is my intent in writing this book.
Yeah, most scholars think that Mark wrote primarily to Roman Christians, so Gentile converts to Christianity, so a little bit different audience there. This short, fast-paced, kind of action-driven book is written for these Gentile Christians kind of in view to show them that Jesus is the Son of God. And so, whereas Matthew might use the language of Messiah more, and quote from the Old Testament prophets saying this was to fulfill the Old Testament prophets. Well, the Gentile Christians weren't as familiar with all those texts. It's still true, but they just needed to know he was the Son of God, and that's what Mark is trying to do. In fact, that's how he opens his book. Mark 1, verse 1, he says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." It's interesting. Caesar referred to himself, Caesar Augustus, as the son of a god. And so I think one of the things Mark is doing is to that same group, right, who would have known who Caesar was, very familiar with that. He's saying, no, Jesus, the Messiah, is the Son of God.
Yeah.
And that's what Mark's trying to do.
And as Mark begins the writing of his book here, you spend some time talking about really the authority of Jesus.
Yeah, the authority of Christ starts with John the Baptist, and you get right into the baptism of Jesus, where God the Father says, "You're my beloved Son, with you I'm well pleased." And that's an indicator that from here on out, in Jesus' ministry and in his teaching, he has a stamp of approval from God the Father and the voice from heaven. People heard it. This was to authenticate what Jesus was doing in his teaching and in his ministry, but it draws opposition very early on, as you read also in the Gospel of Matthew. As we get into chapters 4 and 5, you have more of those parables. I think one of the ones, all the parables are great. One of the ones that's really, I think, become important to me just practically when it comes to the mission, because we actually started this week with the Great Commission in Matthew 28.
Right.
We talked about it last week, but Jesus gives a parable in Mark 4, the parable of the sower and the different types of soil, that I think when you think about that parable in light of the Great Commission in Matthew 28, it really helps us make sense of it. He says there's different kinds of soil when a sower goes out to sow, and a sower may sow some seed on a path, and it doesn't even land in dirt at all, and the birds just come down and they snatch it right off the path before it ever takes root. And sometimes the sower may sow some seed, into ground that's rocky, and the roots can't grow down deep, and it springs up for a minute and withers away. And then sometimes, the sower will sow some seed into some dirt that has a lot of weeds in it, and the weeds choke it out and are also they're competing for the water and sunlight, and the plant dies. And then sometimes the sower sows some seed on good soil, and it springs up and it yields 100-fold. And Jesus says in that parable, here's what I'm trying to teach you. You guys are going to be sowers, just like I have been, sowing the seed of the gospel. Jesus has been sowing the seed of the gospel. And if you count up like the number of encounters Jesus has and the people that he's sharing the good news, proclaiming the good news to, you will find that only a fraction of them wind up being good soil.
Sure.
Yeah. And if you think about the soil types, only 1 out of 4 types of soil that Jesus gives in this parable is good soil. One of the things Jesus is trying to teach us about the Great Commission in Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey me. He's trying to teach us that the majority of people are probably not going to be good soil. And that's at one level, that's sad.
Right.
Because you want everybody to go to heaven. You want everybody to receive the gospel. But at one level, it's also a relief, because sometimes we can get discouraged when we share the gospel with people and they don't receive it. And maybe we think we've done something wrong or we messed it up or we need to practice more or whatever. But in reality, it could just be that you're experiencing what Jesus was explaining in this parable. You're sharing with someone who's rocky soil, or you're sharing with someone who's weedy soil, or the path, or whatever, and they're just not good soil. Now, the cool thing about evangelism is that sometimes in one season of a person's life, there may be bad soil, but 10 years later, God has a way of changing soil types.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul is a great example of that.
Yeah.
I don't know if Jesus ever met Paul. It's possible that he met him in his earthly ministry. Paul was a prominent Pharisee.
Sure.
Maybe he was around and just wasn't named in the Gospels. But if he did meet Paul before his death and resurrection, Paul would have been rocky soil, or the path, or hard soil. And he was not receptive to Christ. But later, he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he was a good soul then.
He sure
and
was.
So it's a great parable that I think helps us make sense of the Great Commission and our job as seed sowers.
I love that you brought that out. And then as we continue to work our way through the book of Mark, we see that we get into the identity of Jesus. And, we see him rejected, John the Baptist beheaded. As you kind of look over the middle part of this book, what stands out to you in these middle chapters?
Well, the middle part of Mark 8, is a dividing line between the two halves of the book of Mark. The first 8.5 or so, 7.5 chapters of Mark are all about the identity of Jesus. It's who Jesus is. He's healing people to show that he's the Son of God. He's casting out demons to show that he's the Son of God. He's teaching the Word of God to show that he's the Son of God. So that's all about the identity of Christ. But then around chapter 8, verse 34 or so, he starts talking about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And so you can actually see it right there. You can see the divide right there in Acts chapter 8. This is the place, by the way, where on the identity of Christ, it says in verse 29, he asked his disciples, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him, because it wasn't his time yet, right? And then here's the shift in verse 31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and killed. And then turning to his disciples, Peter said, "No, don't do that." And he said, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're not setting your mind on the things of God." And then he says this, verse 34, and calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said, "If anyone would come after me," here's discipleship. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what is the profit of man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?" So I'm the Christ. I'm going to suffer and die as the Christ. And then if you want to follow me, and that's who I am, that's my identity. If you want to follow me, discipleship, then you take up your cross and follow me. And then the rest of the Gospel of Mark is about him, kind of heading toward the cross and having encounters with people like the rich young man and others who he's calling to follow him. Follow me. And so the second half of Mark is kind of about following Jesus.
Yeah. And as we kind of go through that section, we go from following Jesus in living out the Christian life to then we get to the disciples following Jesus into the final period of his earthly life here, that final week, triumphal entry, and what follows there. As we look at the last chapters, 11 through the end of the book, what maybe stands out to you? Anything different than what we talked about in Matthew, or just a reiteration of what we've already read? Yeah,
it's a lot of the same things. I mean, this Mark 10, verse 45, I think is a great summary verse that describes kind of the way of the cross. He says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And his point is, that's what I'm calling you to do as well. Take your crosses, follow me, live to serve humanity. like I have. And then he says that, and then in the very next chapter, that starts his final week of life on this earth.
Yeah.
You have the triumphal entry in Mark 11, where the crowds are shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, in Mark chapter 11, verse 9. And then Jesus goes in and cleanses the temple. And I think probably some of those people who were welcoming him, when he goes in and cleanses the temple, that really offends them. And that starts the process where things are really heating up. In chapter 8, he tells his disciples at that point, don't even tell them that I'm the Messiah yet. Mm-hmm. But now he's revealing his identity. So in this last week of his ministry, in chapters 11 and following, Jesus is truly revealing who he is. Again, he's coming, like Zechariah 9:9 said he would, on a donkey. Mm-hmm. He is doing that intentionally to say, I'm the Messiah. He goes into the temple and cleanses it like the Messiah would do. And then he gives these parables that are, these particular parables, the parables of the tenants and things like that, are targeting these growingly hostile religious crowds and saying, you are wicked tenants.
Yeah.
You have polluted the temple. You have not taken care of God's people. You are wicked tenants. And so he's really, the heat is really heating up on him as he begins to reveal more and more to the public, to the crowds, not just his disciples, who he is, who he claims to be, and the sin that is in their lives, which then leads to the passion in chapters 14 and 15, where he has the Last Supper. The next day, he is in Gethsemane, mm-hmm. and then being crucified and killed, and then in chapter 16, rising. Now, one of the interesting things about Mark 16, I know that this is in our next week's reading technically, but I like to treat it all together, is you have the resurrection of Jesus in Mark chapter 16, and then you're going to get into something next week, if you're doing this on schedule, where you're going to have some verses that are in brackets. Okay, maybe we should just conclude by talking about that. So I'm using the ESV right now, and Mark 16 in my version, verse 8 is the last words. And then you have some bracketed things that say some of the earliest manuscripts do not include verses 9 through 20. You have what's often referred to as the long ending of Mark. By the way, in this long ending of Mark is where you have things about handling snakes.
Right.
So the snake handling churches, they're using some passages of Scripture that probably weren't even original to Mark. But here's what's happening in the long ending of Mark, and there's a couple of other places in John chapter 8 where you have the story of the woman caught in adultery and things like that. You have the Bible was original. We don't have any of the original documents that were originally written. Like when Mark first wrote this, we don't have his handwriting on a piece of parchment, a paper or something, but we do have copies.
Yeah.
And so the Bible, like any ancient document, was copied over and over and over again. And we have more and older, reliable documents that prove the reliability of the New Testament and of the biblical books than we do of almost any ancient document in history. So it's very reliable.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that there aren't still small discrepancies where scholars say, well, I don't know if this part is actually original. Some of this wasn't in the original manuscripts. And so that's what you have there at the very end of Mark 16. Don't let that alarm you. Probably what you have here are stories that really might have happened, and that some scribes thought were supposed to be included, and so they copied it in there, but it wasn't necessarily original. So if I was preaching through the Gospel of Mark, I would stop at verse 8.
Yeah.
I wouldn't keep going. I think I would read it just to say, hey, these are probably some eyewitness early testimonies of stories of things that happened, but not part of the inspired Word of God.
All right. I think that's really helpful because that's one of those things that a lot of us would certainly pick up on pretty quickly as we get to that point in our reading, saying, all right, so what do I think about those verses 9 and later? And hope that is helpful, as well as kind of the breakdown of the overall book of Mark as we spend the vast majority of our time in Mark this week. If you have fallen behind and you're reading it all, or you want to go back and maybe check out a previous podcast episode, you can find all those links, all that information when you visit our website, belleirebc.com/Bible. And if you've not done so yet, it's not too late. You can follow along by podcasting the program, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, other podcast platforms, or even watch on YouTube. But thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and hope you'll join us next time.
Thank you for listening to the Year of the Bible podcast. For more information about Belle Aire Baptist Church, go to belleirebc.com.